My name is Vince Cawley. I'm Assistant Secretary, NTEU New South Wales. Today, we'll be speaking about the recent annual reports that have been posted by New South Wales universities. The outstanding and headline issue I think that everyone has noticed is that universities have certainly bounced back in a financial sense for 2021, so that in New South Wales, every single one of the 10 universities in New South Wales has posted a surplus, a budget surplus for 2021. And many of the Vice Chancellors and university managers will say coyly, they're some quite good numbers. That's strictly speaking in a financial sense, because as we know in the NTU, and as I'm sure many of you are feeling materially, there's a lot of people who have lost their job out of the last couple of years. Workloads are at an all-time high. We're really feeling it. Job insecurity is still a real thing. And there's a lot of work to be done in terms of investing in the people that make universities what they are, the staff. And so to discuss all this, we have today Dr. Terri MacDonald, who's the Director of the Policy and Research Unit nationally for the NTEU. She'll be speaking first and go through all the juicy numbers that have emerged from the annual budgets and the annual reports. And we also have Dr. Damien, who's the NTEU New South Wales Secretary, to follow up. And this, of course, will be an ongoing discussion for the next little while, noting that the union is, of course, at every single university in New South Wales engaged in enterprise bargaining negotiations. So very topical. So without further ado, it's over to you, Terri.
Thanks very much, Vince. And I will just quickly say that my colleague Kieran McCarran is also going to be online. Now, Kieran's the other person in the policy unit, and he's going to, share the screen and talk a little bit about some of the graphs that we've got. We have a bit of a tag team where he'll talk a little bit about those. But I'm going to quickly go through them because I am conscious we are short on time. So Kieran, you want to flick through to the first slide?
Yep.
Okay, so just very quick overview of what university funding is. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, just put it very broadly, what the state of play is for our universities and what we're looking forward to, as well as some of the things that you might come up with when you're talking to your university managements during bargaining. So Kieran, flick on through. Okay, so the first part of this, of course, is how a university is funded. So breakdown of university funding, very simply put. There's lots of complexity in it, but at its very base level, you've got government research and teaching grants, you've got student fees, and you've got other income. Now, of those, the government research and teaching grants, the biggest chunk of those are things like, your Commonwealth Grant Scheme funding and your research grants, and they they're quite a substantial proportion. But the other bit, of course, is your student fees. So that's basically your international student fees, which are actually quite important in in the scheme of things, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then you've got your help, your domestic students, and then there's a little bit of domestic full fee students. And then you've got other income, which this in last year was actually quite important, but I can talk about that in a second. So if we flick through, this just gives you a bit of an idea where things are. So this is the relative share over time from 2006 to 2020. And the reason why this is worth noting is if you look at the green line, which is your international student fee line. So you can see about 2013, that just started to go up. And when we got to about 2017, it really went up. So what's happened is at the same time, around 2016, 2017, as the international student fees went up, your other proportion of Commonwealth government scheme funding, which is the money that the government gives to universities to deliver teaching to students, essentially starts to decline. The student contributions are relatively even, although in 2020 they have gone up slightly too. But the big spike in all of that has been the CGS, has been the international money, while at the same time the what the Commonwealth has been paying has been declining. So that then gives you a bit of an idea of where things were when COVID hit. So Kiri, you want to flick through? Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the situation for the New South Wales universities in particular. So we're all aware of what happened in 2020. COVID hit, it was not great. But in 2021, the universities, an overview but in 2021, the universities in New South Wales certainly did better than they did the previous year. And on the surfaces of it, you've got, at the moment in annual reports, 9 of 10 reporting surpluses. In 2020, only 4 of them did. So the combined total incomes for 10 New South Wales institutions increased by around 15%. From the previous year, 2020-21, total expenditure is up by around 5.8, and this is primarily due to what they call employee savings and employee benefits, which is your biggest expenditure item. We can talk about that in a second. Now, importantly to this, government assistance also increased by around 8.6%. And that included the New South Wales universities getting that proportion of the $1 billion of research block funding that occurred in 2020. So they brought that in. Now, the other thing is there's also investment income. So universities were, looking at what they had on their books in terms of investments, looking at where they could pull things in. There also, too, was the once-off transfer and sale of the IDP Australian shares. So IDP Australian shares was essentially the company that universities had together, which was, their international education marketing company. So they essentially sold that off. If you want to flick over, Kieran. The other thing to note is that in the student income in 2021 was not as bad as they thought it might be. Now, essentially, there was only $10 million less than what they got in 2020. And they basically saved themselves on the international student front. So what they had in the pipeline, they were able to keep those students, those international students, and continue them through. We also had, to a certain extent, notwithstanding the Jobs Ready graduate package, which is, played around with the proportion of funding universities are getting, and they're getting slightly less per student. The flip side of that is we actually have had an increase in the age of students who are basically going through the system and heading into universities. It's a population jump. So you've got that playing out as well. So essentially, there was still a little bit less, but they certainly weren't as bad as they thought they were going to be. And in funding, it was comparable to 2020. However, the slight fly in the ointment is that universities in New South Wales are still really heavily reliant on the Chinese market for their international student fees, more than anywhere else in the country. And that does leave them open, to fluctuations in that market, both political and economic. So that's something that we're not quite sure have to pay out. Having said that, it's very likely, though, with the Labor government, it's not going to be as adverse as it could have been with, the coalition. Kieran, you want to flick through? Okay, so looking at the detail a little bit more, and I will say some of this stuff is from a recent report that's just come out from Frank Larkins, who's also been looking at the New South Wales universities as we have. So some of his stuff, that his analysis he's put into was quite interesting. But in the short, majority of universities in 2020 had a loss from the previous year in 2019. From this year, from 2020 to 21, a majority again recorded an increase in their total income. So New South Wales, the change was from a 4.7, decrease from 2019 to 2020 when we had that COVID bit, to over 15% increase for the last, financial year. So, that actually has a real impact. Now, some of those institutions did particularly well, like Sydney and Newcastle and UNSW and a few others. So only Southern Cross had a lower income in 2021 than it did the previous year. So the interesting thing to note about this, though, is the income gains exceeded the benefits they got from selling off their shares in IDP and everything else that they had, as well as the research funding. They are once off. So what the universities will be looking at now is their expenditure. So Kieran, do you want to flick through? All right. Now, the expenditure is of course, something we know all about. Universities were very much split evenly between those that had increased it, and those reduced it in 2019 to 2020. But in 2021, all universities reported lower expenditure. Now, it was a considerable decrease, almost just under a 6% decrease. And that's essentially coming down to their employee benefits, or essentially how much they are spending on staffing. And we know that because we saw thousands of job losses. So that was reflected in their numbers. So in short, they didn't do as badly as they thought they would do in terms of keeping students. They got some money from the government. They got some money from, selling off shares and things like that. And then they cut staff. So this is essentially where we're sitting at the moment. And that's, what's behind what are good figures on paper for, the university's, financial health, if you want to call it that. Essentially, it's reflected in the thousands of jobs that we saw lost. Kieran? Okay. So, Kieran, this is one of your ones, if you want to quickly talk about it.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to kind of jump in after Terri and add a little bit to a few of these points. So the university income increased dramatically in 2021, but at the same time, we've seen their spending on staff has actually decreased. And a big part of that is the fact that there's less staff who are doing more work because the student numbers haven't decreased at all. So the number of casuals here is amplified a bit because we're estimating them, but you can see across the board, we've lost a lot of staff. And that feeds into the percentage of share of expenditure that is being invested in staff. And over time, this has been decreasing. So it's up a little bit recently because of COVID, but in the long term, universities have been spending less and less on staff. And there's no real reason why it has to be that way. So some university managers say, oh, we want to spend 50% is a good amount to spend on staff, but historically 50% is really low. And so that's something to think about. What is the correct amount to be investing in staff in a university? And does it have to always be going down? When we look at expenditure on staff as a percentage of total income, it's actually much lower. So this first chart is looking at the percent as a portion of their total spending, and this is a portion of their total income. So that's kind of an interesting, important distinction to make, because the university will often want to look at this one, but it's kind of important to look at this one as well, because this basically removes out the university's decision to make a surplus, which is their decision, and they often want to make large surpluses. And so when they make large surpluses, their spending of income on staff as a percentage decreases rapidly. And so it's actually now a historical all-time low even though it was a bumper income year, sure, but we're under 50% now across New South Wales unis, which is really low. And last year it was really high because there wasn't much of a surplus. So in bargaining, it's really important to look at the share of the pie that staff are getting, and to make that case that, hey, why is 47% when 10 years ago it was 57%? Where's all that money going? So these are important things to look at, and in your branches, you should be looking at that for your local branch in particular. This is percentage of income 2021 spent on staff across the state. And there's a huge variation. So, Sydney had a huge income, so suddenly that percentage drops. But it's interesting to note the variation, but it's also interesting to note there's a lot under 50% there, and historically under 50% is really low in the national context in the last 20 years. There's not many universities in any of the last 20 years where they spent less than 50% of their income on staff. So that's a bit of a historical context there to think about bargaining. Something else I wanted to talk about thinking about bargaining is, what are the university management saying about these surpluses, and what types of things do they say to our reasonable claims? A really common thing that they'll say every year about every annual report is, oh, but there was this investment that just did really well, or oh, we had this windfall gain, or we sold this building. So really, when you think about it, we actually lost money. And year after year after year, they're saying this, but it seems like every year there's something that they point to. Oh, that was a big research grant we got this year. So there's always something they're trying to claim that wasn't really money, but actually was really money that they did actually get. And so if they're clever, if they're reasonably skilled managers, they should be able to take their windfall gains and convert them into income and convert them into ongoing gains. So I suppose in bargaining, something I think branches should be putting to management is, okay, well, you have $1 billion now. How can you invest that to create sustainable income so that we can afford to invest in staff and we do have certainty, rather than just blowing it on something? So a one-off gain, you can convert to ongoing income. You can pay down your debt so that you're not paying, the universities are paying tens of millions of years in bank interest. You could pay off that debt and now you're not paying $20 million a year in interest. Or, $1 billion, that would save you $40 million a year in interest.
That's just about time, Kieran.
Okay. Yep. But yeah, you could borrow less. They could make more investments that have yield. So a one-off gain can be income, and it's not nothing. So that's something to put to them. They say the international student market looks bad, but it wasn't as bad as they projected. And in 2020, they put out some absolutely horrible projections saying return to normal in 2025. That's why we need to lose staff. But if you look at Sydney Uni, they're already back above the 2019 level of income. So they bounced back really quick. They talk really pessimistically about federal funding, and that's true to some extent, but at the same time, the outlook for federal funding is probably better than ever because the Labor government just came in, and we certainly don't think they're going to cut it anymore. And the federal funding is less important to them overall than it has ever been. So it's only 22% of their income now. So if it gets cut 1% or 4%, like it did recently, it's really only ends up being 1% of their overall. And the places have been unfrozen at least. So that's at least something. So I think this is the kind of our last slide. So yeah, looking ahead, we have the Labor government talking about an accord between universities, unions, the government and students to some kind of New Deal or some kind of reform that they're looking at. We don't really know what exactly that will look like, but certainly we're hopeful about it and that it will be an improvement on the jobs ready. The ARC is up for a review and inquiry into how ARC operates. Yeah, so Terri, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say, so the signals that we're getting from the government at the moment are from the new minister, and meanwhile, noting, of course, he's only just sort of, picked up the portfolio, is that they're really looking to push the international education side of things. So it's unlikely that we'll see the government go much into the jobs ready graduate stuff at the moment. Having said that, they really, really want to open up the doors to international marketing. And to be honest, that's where the bulk of money is coming from. Now, we can have discussions over whether or not that's a good thing for the future of the sector, and we can do that as part of these accord, in inverted commas, discussions. But the reality is, in the next few years, the universities are not going to be crying as poor as they would otherwise have made out. So I think we'll leave it on that, Kieran.
Yep, I'm happy to leave it there.
All right, thank you for that, Terri and Kieran. Our next speaker is Damien Cahill, who's the New South Wales NTEU Secretary. And just following on, I guess, from that set of numbers and just acknowledging enterprise bargaining, it's not too bad. The good news is that universities have bounced back. We have had a change of government, and how refreshing after the last couple of years. So I guess it's to talk about possibilities and the context and what this means for us at the moment in universities. Take away, Damien.
Thanks, Vince. Hey, everyone. And I'll also acknowledge that I'm on Aboriginal land today, on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded. I want to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members who are joining us today. So I don't have any slides. I'm just going to make an argument about how to make sense of these figures and what it means for our enterprise bargaining campaign and our campaign for to increase federal funding. I just want to suggest in my talk that the most fruitful way to make sense of the recent surpluses that we've seen and what Terri and Kieran were talking about, the university surpluses, is in two ways. First, it's a product of decades of federal government policy settings where federal funding is significantly less than the costs of carrying out core university functions of teaching and research. And secondly, that these surpluses have been driven by the corporatisation of university governance, which has led to university managements increasingly viewing the world and viewing their institutions as if the university were a profit-making corporation, not a public institution. So I want to go through that as a way of interpreting these surpluses. And I want to put forward some, I guess, proposals for addressing this situation and what the surpluses mean for the NTEU's enterprise bargaining campaign to build better workplaces and better universities, which we're engaged in right now. And then we'll open it up we'll have some questions and answers. So just in terms of the role of federal funding, just building on what Terri was saying, essentially for the last couple of decades, both sides of politics have pursued essentially an austerity regime with respect to university funding. One side of politics, of course, has pursued that much more aggressively than the other, the coalition side. But Australia actually has one of the lowest rates of public funding of universities of any country throughout the OECD. Federal funding of universities accounts for only about half of all university revenue if you include HECS and HELP funds. If you exclude the HECS and HELP funds, then it's about a third of university revenue. And we know that there's a huge gap between the costs of universities carrying out their core activities of teaching and research and the funds received from the government for such things, particularly with respect to research. And what that means is that universities over the last 2 decades have been encouraged to pursue other forms of revenue to supplement the fact that public funding isn't sufficient to cover the cost of the activities that they need to perform. Most particularly, this has been in the form of student fees, particularly international student fees, but also postgraduate coursework student fees. But as we've seen in the recent budget surpluses, they've also been pursuing other forms of market-based revenue, investments, sale of assets, etc. So that's the first piece of the puzzle in terms of understanding the origins of these university surpluses and making sense of them. The second is the role of the way in which universities are governed, because again, concurrently with the austerity regime that's been occurring over the last 2 decades, universities have become more corporatized, and in particular, have become more corporatized in their governance. On the one hand, there's been an erosion of the representative structures on the university governing boards, whether they're university councils, boards of trustees, or senates. They go by different names at different universities. And in the place of representative structures, where in the past there were places for student representatives, staff representatives, representatives from alumni, even representatives from the state government, in place of these is the rise of ministerial and direct appointments from council. So much so that at the moment, 1/3 of all representatives on university governing boards are from the corporate sector, most of whom have little or no direct experience with universities, except for the fact that many of them studied at a university once, but they have little experience of an understanding of how universities actually operate in practice, what it's like to work in a university, and the governing practices as they operate on the ground. At the same time, as we know, contributing to the more corporate outlook of universities is the massive inflation in senior executive salaries. Most strikingly, the inflation of Vice Chancellor salaries. So Vice Chancellor salaries and packages of over $1 million now not at all uncommon. And of course, that's far in excess of the salary of the Prime Minister, of state premiers, and of senior public servants. So these factors, these more corporate-oriented factors, have combined with the funding settings that I talked about earlier, the austerity regime, to drive many of the perversities that we experience in the higher education system. They help explain the surpluses, but they also, I think, help make the case for reforming university governance and reforming the funding system itself. And this is where we get to what we need to campaign on as university staff. And we saw during the pandemic how much and how directly the corporate mentality dominates governance at our universities. Because when the pandemic hit and when university revenues were threatened, albeit with what was only ever likely to be a temporary downturn, the first response, the very first response from those who govern our universities was the corporate response. It was cut and restructure. And we know that had devastating effects, not just for the institutions, but obviously for the individuals who lost their jobs and for their colleagues who were forced in many cases to take on the work that was previously done by those colleagues. And so we've seen massive workload intensification at the same time as massive redundancies and job losses and casuals and fixed term staff losing their jobs as well. So as I said, this downturn was only ever likely to be short term. So the corporate response, as well as being damaging, was really short-sighted and unjustified. And we can see this kind of corporate response and corporate behaviour and corporate gaze reflected in the composition of the recent university budget surpluses. Because if you have a look at the surpluses, and this gets to the point that Terri was making, the source of revenue increases, apart from that one-off $1 billion grant from the federal government last year for research, the sources of revenue increase were predominantly market-based sources of revenue: international student fee income, returns on investment, and sale of property or other assets, such as the shares in IDP Education that Terri mentioned. So what's been happening? What's been happening is universities with corporately focused governing structures, universities who have been incentivized by governments to chase additional sources of revenue, have become heavily dependent on generating private sources of income. And in doing this, they've taken on enormous risks. And this helps to explain the massive shift of institutional risk onto staff. This helps to explain the rise of insecure employment, workload intensification, and rampant workplace restructuring. This is an example of university management shifting that institutional risk of being reliant on market-based income onto staff. And at the same time, we've seen wild gyrations in university budget positions in recent years, whether it's because of fluctuations in international student fee income, or whether it's because universities have engaged in other corporate strategies like underwriting the profits of private providers. For example, the University of Wollongong actually lost about $169 million, was revealed in the 2021 annual report, because it was subsidising private student accommodation and their profitability, and it's taken a big loss on that. At the same time, the corporate gaze and the corporate orientation of the university governing structures means, as Terri and Kieran were pointing out, that university managers express a reluctance to invest these sometimes huge surpluses. And remember, at University of Sydney, the surplus was over $1 billion, a reluctance to invest these surpluses in staff. So they'll say that they're quarantining funds to for some future time. To quote the University of Sydney annual report, quarantining investment to shield the university against unforeseen circumstances. Well, we know that the last 2 years have been the least foreseen circumstances, or least foreseeable circumstances one could imagine, but the universities haven't invested those surpluses in staff. They want to hold on to them for a supposed rainy day. Well, it's absolutely pouring throughout the sector, and the time is now to invest in staff. So very quickly, what can be done? I think there's little doubt that the surpluses that have been recorded, particularly the huge surpluses recorded in places like Sydney, and the proportionately high surpluses in places like University of Newcastle, Charles Sturt University, are going to make it more politically difficult to secure increased public funding for higher education, because no doubt there'll be elements within the Labor government who will look at some of those surpluses and they'll say, well, seems like universities are doing pretty well. They don't need increases in public funding. But I think it actually makes the case for public funding much more clearly. And I think this is some of the arguments that we need to make as staff and as unionists, because actually the experience of university budgets over the last 2 years, the wild fluctuations that we've seen from deficits to massive eye-wateringly large surpluses, underscores the need for increased and stable public funding. Because an increased and stable public funding base for universities would remove those wild fluctuations from universities that, because of essentially government austerity, have been encouraged to become dependent on broader market forces for their revenue. At the same time, I think that these huge surpluses and the reluctance of university managers to invest them in staff simultaneously makes the case very clearly for the need to reform university governance. Because just in and of itself, increasing the public funding base for universities doesn't guarantee that they'll reinvest that revenue in staff, which of course is the key to underpinning quality of university teaching and research. So what might this governance reform look like? I'm just going to sketch out a few options and we can open it up for questions. There are plenty of ways you could do this. One suggestion would be to tie government funding to particular employment outcomes, such as the need to invest in secure jobs and decrease the proportion of casual and fixed term labour and increase the proportion of secure jobs. This was actually suggested by the recent Senate Select Committee on Job Security, which was chaired by Labor MP Tony Sheldon. And one of their conclusions was that, and I'll quote, as a condition of receiving public funding, universities should set publicly available targets for increasing permanent employment and reducing casualisation. So that's one option for reform, tying funding to particular employment outcomes. Another option would be perhaps to give TEXA or another regulatory agency more teeth to enforce compliance with their own enterprise agreements and the Fair Work Act. We know that TEXA has taken an interest recently in rampant insecure employment in the sector, which is good, but we need a body that has the ability to force universities to comply with those obligations. So that's another possibility. And of course, in terms of reforming university governance, noting the point I made before, governing boards of universities are in urgent need of reform. In New South Wales, the NTEU is campaigning on this at the state level in order to make university governing boards more representative of the university community and increase the proportion of places on university boards that are representative of the university community. And I think in all this, we need to remember that universities are public institutions. They're not private institutions for the most part. They're public institutions. They have a remit to engage in teaching and research in the broad public interest. And therefore, they should be governed as public institutions, not as corporations. On some of these issues, however, particularly on the issues of winning better workplaces, things like secure jobs, we don't have to wait for the government to act, because as Kieran said, at every university in New South Wales and the ACT, and I know, shout out to members who are joining us from the ACT today, we are in enterprise bargaining. Enterprise bargaining is our opportunity to win better conditions in our workplace. And we are campaigning right now at every university across ACT in New South Wales, or CSU will be joining the campaign soon, for secure jobs. We're campaigning for regulations against overwork, for checks on endless workplace restructuring, for gender affirmation leave, working from home rights for professional staff, and a fair pay rise. The massive surpluses that have been generated by universities actually show very, very clearly that our claims are reasonable and that universities can afford our claims. And so I just want to conclude by shouting out to everyone here. If you're not a union member already, please join the NTEU. And if you are a union member, please get involved in our campaign, become an agent for change, for better workplaces and better universities through our enterprise bargaining campaign. I believe we've got the prospect to achieve really significant improvements in working conditions. And I'm looking forward to working with all members around the state to achieve this.